God, or union with the divine is something that is beyond anything that we can truly experience in a sensory way. It's not it's not literally sort of seeing a vision, right? It's not anything in the world that we might see. It's not anything that we can truly comprehend with the understanding. And remember, the idea for mystics, this thing of beyond understanding, beyond concepts, really is an expression of an idea of infinity. We can understand the word or the concept of infinity as like this endless series of numbers, for example, but we can't comprehend it with our understanding in the sense of realizing what the end of that series is, right? Because the series has no end. So it's something like that. It's beyond, we can understand it in one sense, but in another sense, we cannot. And when we get to this idea of the mystical union, we reach the level at which it's no longer conceptual, right? That's union, pure unitary consciousness. So everything is one. Duality is dissolved. Its multiplicity is obliterated, as it says. And in this space of this consciousness of union with the divine, there is only the supreme good. There is only the one. Okay. So in in one respect, mystics, when they talk in this way, they're talking about an experience they've had, and in another way, they're talking about um, they're talking about the ultimate nature of the universe. So in a sense, it's also a metaphysical idea that everything emanates from one which is infinite and indescribable and does not have any sort of division of duality within it. So that's an idea of this is the fundamental nature of the universe, and so we can almost see an idea of an emanation here from that which is beyond consciousness to dreamless sleep, then to the intelligent nature, and then to sort of what that which we perceive, what he calls the universal person. Right? Okay, so if we were to again go back to the notion of a Buddha within or a Christ within, which aspect of these four aspects would you think of as being the closest thing to that Buddha? Is it the universal person in his mental nature, or is it that or is it that deepest level beyond comprehension, or is it this that dwells within us that's the origin of all and yet is a sort of state of dreamless sleep? Which of those different aspects would you think of as being would you identify with the inner Buddha or the inner Christ? Again, if just unmute yourself and talk if you have a comment on that. Anyone? Go ahead, Rosemary.
Well, as I've been studying the levels of awareness, they're all expressions of the universal person. But as we rise in our sense of oneness with what is the self here, the fourth one is a higher and different experience than the third one or the second one or the first one.
Okay, so it's all self, but it's just higher or deeper experiences. So in a sense, it's different levels of the Buddha mind or the Christ mind, something like that. Okay, that makes sense to me. Any other thoughts? I think when we go ahead.
I was thinking of the idea that one presence that we utter so often in my unity center, and how and then so the universal person sort of represents that whole idea. But I kind of like what I think it was Rosemary that said it's kind of all of them, all of these different levels at some point in time, even knowing the universal person can never, as far as I can tell, or I think, can never be not here, not me, not you, not separate.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah, good.
yeah, I don't know. It's that's why I'm here, because these things just love it.
If you think about too these descriptions, you can almost relate to them as um, I would say levels of or different aspects of meditation. You might start meditating on, for example, the universe in a sense, the nature, right, as the universal person in this sense, sort of the objective consciousness, right, and then you might go inward and be focused really completely within your own mind on ideas. So you sort of lose track. You're no longer engaged with the outer world. You're engaged more inwardly with your own ideas or what's happening in your soul, if I can put it that way. You can also reach a state of consciousness that you're not even aware of in meditation. You're not even aware of concepts or words, and yet you're still conscious, right? So there's a sense in which it's like dreamless sleep because there's not content either in terms of forms or sounds of words or anything like that, and yet you're still conscious. This might be a state in which you're not aware of time passing. You may not even be aware of your body, and then sort of the highest level, the mystical union. There's a kind of dissolving of everything as an idea that it's obliterated. And then there's this ineffable, described in different ways, ineffable peace, supreme good, and so on and so forth. So this would signify sort of the deepest, a level of meditation that is um, beyond something that we consciously control or aim at, that sort of that may come upon us, I guess you could say. And what we'll see as we go through this is that some mystical experiences are not a result necessarily of a conscious and intentional discipline of meditation, but sort of arise spontaneously, right? As a result, maybe of we might say of life experience, something like that, but not necessarily connected to any particular religious or spiritual tradition. Let's go ahead and move forward a little bit farther here. Okay, so this is from Shankara, who is an 8th century. Shankara is generally regarded as sort of the greatest or one of the greatest of all Hindu philosophers, right? Or uh, all teachers who systematically organized and sort of synthesized ideas, all the sort of ideas that had come before him. And so Shankara is very highly regarded even today. I think of him as sort of like uh, maybe equivalent to somebody like Thomas Aquinas in the Catholic tradition, someone who sort of sets a new level that everyone agrees you know is like this is like one of the best systems, if you will. But anyway, so Shankara says, like an image in a dream, the world is troubled by love, hatred, and other poisons. One of the interesting things you'll sometimes find in mystical writings is that love is not always necessarily spoken of in sort of divine terms or positive terms. It's sometimes recognized that uh, love in some of its manifestations in human experience can actually create problems. Uh, you can see how uh, a love that sort of has its boundaries, can also result not only extreme love for tribe or person, uh, could also result in hatred of other. Right. So we get attached to a particular group, and then those who are not in the group, that arouses certain kinds of things. So in that sense, I'm trying to explain this perspective of love as a poison. Okay, he's speaking really of worldly love in sort of its limited sense, and you do find that in some other spiritual and metaphysical writings. But in any case, he goes on and says, so long as the dream lasts, the image appears to be real, but on awakening, it vanishes. Okay, so that's why it's like a dream. So awakening, spiritual awakening, or the mystical awakening, sort of dissolves the troubles of the world because they're as a dream. Do not accept them as the ultimately real. From the having had sort of one of these profound spiritual experiences where the spiritual dimension of reality is the real, and the world of our ordinary perceptions and thoughts is in comparison like a dream. It's illusionary in certain respects. So when he goes on, that being, true, intelligent, comprehends within itself every variety of being, penetrating and permeating all as a thread which strings together beads. So this is a nice metaphor of, if we think of the world as a kind of, if you think of the cosmos as a kind of giant piece of jewelry, then being is like a thread that holds all of that together without us necessarily being able to see it or perceive it in the same way that we would as he puts together the beads. So it's a nice little metaphor. Okay, and then the next point, this conception, I am Brahman itself, incessantly entertained, disperses the hallucinations born of ignorance as medicine disperses illness. So this is a very bold sort of concept to hold in mind when we look at it from a theistic sort of Western perspective, because from a theistic and Western perspective, to say I am God itself would be considered blasphemous, which creates a problem if Jesus does come back and says, I am God itself, and they will probably once again say he's blaspheming. And so, he run into a bunch of trouble that way. But this is the idea that he's not saying this is something that's a sort of privilege of a particular person as a result of their fundamental spiritual nature. He's saying this is the truth of what we are. I am God itself, right? And that if we incessantly entertain this disperses these hallucinations, this dream world that's troubled by various poisons, as he puts it. And so, if you were to say, for example, in the Christian tradition, I am Christ itself, it would be the same thing, some kind of thing, or I am the Father, right? Or I am the Father, Mother, or any sort of claim of divine nature. But of course, he's not saying go around and say this to everybody here. He's saying incessantly entertain it, right? So we're holding it in our consciousness in a way to dissolve sort of the lesser uh, elements of consciousness that aren't as real, or that are only as real as a dream. So this is again something that you will sometimes find in mysticism, because of their experience of the divine. Um, they think of the world as Maya. This is sort of the Hindu concept of Maya, which is God's play or illusion. Um, that the world is somewhat illusionary. So this is an idea that had been around in Hinduism, and obviously an idea that Shankara holds to. For him, uh, ultimate reality is one, and that one is the divine, is Brahman or Atman. And he holds as anything less than that is not quite the truth. It is, in some sense, illusionary. Yes, Patty?
Well, I was thinking, if I went around telling other people that I am Brahmin and you are not, this is the problem. That
Yeah.
I who is separate from you am Brahmin and you are not. But I get what they're saying here, because I, in this sense, is wholeness, or all of it, sort of a thing. And there's no distinction between me and you, because me and you is just a concept. And it's actually quite practical to drop that concept. But yeah, I can see if I went around saying that I'm Brahmin and you're not, then I'm gonna get in
I am
trouble.
right. So the danger, if you call it a danger, the danger of this is um, the the delusion that when I say I am, the delusion of the ego associating the human self as sort of special, which is exactly kind of what you're, another way of, I think, saying what you're saying. I am Brahman and you are not. I remember a psychology self-help book from the 70s, probably. The title was I'm Okay, You're Okay. And if the title had been I'm Okay and You're Not, that would be a whole different sort of thing, right? I also remember Chevy Chase from Saturday Night Live saying, I'm Chevy Chase and you're not, is one of his opening for his news broadcast. But anyway, yeah, that's exactly right. If you're saying I am Brahman itself, and you mean by that your ego and your persona, then you've pretty much missed the point that Shankar is making here. So it's an important thing. Did anyone else have any other comments about this particular?
I also feel that this I am Brahman or I am Buddha also needs a little bit clarification, is that we are, in essence, the Brahman, the Buddha, but we are just a piece of that. We are not the whole.
Right.
And we might not express all the qualities, so resulting in walking half asleep all the time.
Right. Well, and the I am that you're talking about there is not your human personhood, which is pretty much, your human personhood, your body and your individual consciousness of yourself as a human person with rights and a life and spouses and all that sort of thing. That is not the I am that is talking about here. That
Yeah.
part, that
And
humanness, is part of the dream of the world, right? So the I am that's Brahman itself is something deeper, and we can even maybe say other than that, so that the human part of it, the body, the individual consciousness, and so on, all the attachments and that sort of thing, is part of Brahman. And what I think Shankara is getting at is to get beyond that individual sort of limited notion of what we are and get in touch with that which we really are, as he would put it, right? That to get to, we're looking at ourselves as one of the beads on the thread, and what in that analogy, we're one of the beads on the thread, that we're part of it. But what he's really saying is, no, what you actually are is the thread. You're the thread that runs through all of it. That's your real self. Now, we aren't, I'll just speak for myself. I am not consciously, you know, identifying at all times with universal self that is beyond all limited concepts. Most of the time, I'm identifying with a body and a person and the relationships and jobs and that sort of notion of self. So you can, the idea here is in the we can adopt the mystical consciousness. Even if we haven't had a mystical experience, we can adopt the mystical metaphysics, if I can put it that way, the mystical worldview, and recognize that all this, that most of the time we take most seriously, every once in a while, you can remember, wait, that's not really what I am. I I am the all. Expand our consciousness of what we are to include our neighborhood, the people we encounter, the cosmos itself, and then not that, but something that underlies all of that. And that's it's a challenging thing to do, but it sort of starts with recognizing that as the truth, sort of adopting, we might call the mystical metaphysics or the mystical paradigm, and then reminding ourselves, very much as in unity, when we read the daily word, for example, we're reminding ourselves of who we are as divine beings, right? You say I am. It's a reminder, or you remind yourself during the day of a truth. When you get disturbed by something, you remind yourself of a metaphysical or a divine truth that brings you back to center and puts things back in focus, right? So it's a journey, and along the way, the mystic isn't always in this consciousness. The mystic sort of gains this consciousness, and then, like the rest of us, sort of has to remind himself or herself of what the truth is, and to recenter, refocus. And that refocusing is what disperses the hallucinations born of ignorance, as Shankara puts it here. Okay. Let me move on to another slide here. This next slide is from the Sufi tradition. In fact, most Sufis say that Rabia of Basra, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that correctly, of Basra, Rabia of Basra, was the first Sufi, or inspired the Sufis with her love poetry and um, her devout and deeply spiritual persona. Her that she is sort of the beginning of Sufism, and her expression of spirituality, I would put right in the mainstream of what Hindus call the Bhakti tradition. So the Bhakti tradition, God is always the beloved. In order to maintain that relationship, the the Bhakti person um, is entirely devoted to God as other. So the Bhakti isn't seeking a merging with the divine, but an experience of the divine, the experience of the other as the beloved. All right. And so this this type of mysticism, which you also find, sort of pretty much pervasive in Christianity, Christian mysticism, is often of the bhakti type, where what is desired is a not necessarily a literal vision, but a kind of vision, a mental, spiritual experience of the beloved. It is usually in Christianity, the beloved would of course be Christ, right? Jesus, a kind of experience that's real. So anyway, here's an example of uh, her poetry. With my beloved, I alone have been, the while amazed between his beauty and his majesty. I stood in silent ecstasy, the whole of beauty singled into a perfect face. Beholding him, would cry, there is no God but he, and he is the Most High. Obviously, this is an English translation. It's attempted to capture the meter and the rhyme. So notice that there's a beholding of the face, but there's also in that beholding a silent ecstasy, that an experience of ultimate beauty. And you might recall that when we were talking way back about Plato, uh, that one of the ideas that Plato recommended for contemplation was the idea of beauty. In Greek mysticism, beauty was like some sort of ultimate idea or experience of the good, sort of the ultimate. So here we see that idea, and that idea of beauty, God as beauty, is recaptured, I want to say, and more emphasized in Sufi mysticism, I think, than it is in Christian mysticism. But not that it's not present in Christian mysticism. So this is a sort of another aspect of mysticism. I've mostly focused here on this sort of the idea of divine union. But I think we can say that the ecstasy of the experience of God as other, but yet as the beloved, right? Because it's a love relationship, which implies two. I think we could still call that a kind of mysticism, right? But it's not the mysticism of divine union exactly. At least that's the way they talk about it. Part of me thinks they talk about it that way, but the experience may actually not be that much different than what the others are talking about in different terms. So here I go to another early Sufi, a very early Sufi, Babakubi, and his poetry. And the Sufi mystics very often express themselves in poetic terms. We also see that in other forms of mysticism. So this is a beautiful piece, I think. Market in the cloister, only God I saw. Again, God is something other that one sees rather merges with, at least initially in the poem. Only God I saw. But when I looked with God's eyes, only God I saw. I oped mine eyes, and by the light of his face around me, in all the eye discovered, only God I saw. Myself, with mine own eyes, I saw most clearly, but when I looked with God's eyes, only God I saw, passed away into nothingness. I vanished, and lo, I was the all-living, only God I saw. So he goes from, one might think, if you think about this again in the sort of ladder, if I'm going to use another metaphor, the ladder to divine, to divine realization and mystical consciousness begins with a sort of outer looking. Often it's looking at the beauty of a person or a nature, but here Bob talks about in the market and in the cloisters, he's talking about really places as much as anything, and very human places, right? The market, the cloister. But then he goes farther and he says he opened his eyes, and by the light of his face around me, only God I saw. So there again is the idea of seeing the face of God. And it may be that this idea of the face of God, the beauty of the face of God, the light of the face of God in the Sufi mysticism is partly from the fact that, of course, their sacred text is the Quran. One of the important passages in the Quran for the Sufi mystics is a saying, I'm going to get the quotation here exactly right, but everywhere you turn, there is the face of God. There's actually a passage in the Quran that says you don't have to face east or west or north or south in a specific way to pray, because everywhere you look, there is the face of God. There's definitely sort of an idea of the omnipresence there, but it's the omnipresence that you sort of see. And so he's talking about this kind of seeing. But then eventually he goes even beyond that. He does it, kind of talks about in the same way that the other mystics that we've looked at and will look at talk about their experience. He passes away into nothingness. He vanishes. Why? Because he's completely dissolved into the divinity, the God. I was the all-living. So this kind of statement is somewhat problematic in the context of Islam, just as I suppose this kind of statement can be somewhat problematic in the context of Christianity, which is to say, if you go around affirming that you are divine, right? I was the all-living. That would be, in conventional Islam, it would be considered blasphemy. And so the Sufis, like Christian mystics, often found themselves at odds with their culture, could sometimes get in trouble depending on sort of what the culture was like in a given time. There was a Sufi mystic, and I'm sorry, I forget who it was, but who had this experience where that was so profound that came out of it. He was sort of still in that the afterglow of the experience, and he went around saying, "I am God," and so they killed him, right? Because that's blasphemy. That was heretic. So talking this way is somewhat dangerous, even in sort of poetic terms, depending again on the place you are, because Muslims are all over the world, and the time period, right? How problematic that is. So Sufis and mainstream Islam have often been at odds. Sometimes the Sufis are more or less accepted in a culture, and sometimes they're not. Right? So let's see. Oh, okay. So now here's another Sufis, one of the most important, because he in effect, for a time anyway, made the Sufis respectable. He explained them in philosophical terms. He's called the proof of Islam, in fact, is one of his nicknames in the context of the culture. AlGhazali, right? So the first passage here, those Gnostics, I like to just stop there for a second and just note that in the Sufi tradition, they use the word, at least in some of the schools of Sufism, they use the word Gnostic, right? Which means knower. And of course, it goes way back to Gnosticism, in the starting really in the time shortly before the time of Jesus, and eventually you have Christian Gnostics. It's a knower. Okay, so that's how he refers to these knowers. These, as his word for what I'm calling mystics, right? So those Gnostics, on their return from their ascent into the heaven of reality, confess with one voice, they saw not existence there save the one real. Only God I saw, as we saw in the last one. They are drowned in the absolute unitude, okay, oneness, and their intelligences were lost in its abyss. And so now, when this state prevails, it is called, in relation to him who experiences it, extinction. Nay, extinction of extinction. For the soul has become extinct to its own extinction. And I put that passage there because I want you to recall the meaning of nirvana in Buddhism. The meaning of nirvana in a sort of literal way is extinction. Right? So when the mystic, when the Buddhist talks about entering nirvana, it's the extinction of the false idea of the self, the illusion of the self. And in the context of Sufism, it has practically the same meaning, even though it's a very different path with different rituals, different sacred texts, different language, and yet somehow Buddhism, and then here later Sufism, they talk about this idea of, they even use their word in their language for extinction to signify sort of this highest state of experience. So I think that's quite remarkable and sort of points to this idea that I've sort of been emphasizing all along, that that the mystical, that throughout all the religions and countries and ages, there have been those who have had these experiences and this way of seeing the world that is out of the mainstream, um, not generally part of the main cultural ideas of their surroundings, and yet they they have the same worldview or perspective as others in other places and other ages. It's fundamentally the same. They talk about it in the same ways. It makes us think that if people through many generations and in many places all saw a particular kind of animal, but it was a very rare animal. So in any given generation, maybe 100 people saw the animal and everybody else did not see the animal. Everybody else that didn't see the animal would probably think, well, there is no such thing as that. They're hallucinating, right? But if the animal keeps showing up in different cultures with different names and it has the same description, you might think, even though it's rare and not many people have seen it, nevertheless, it's there, right? So that's kind of another way of looking at this this thread that runs through the beads of all these different, if I could adopt a metaphor, the beads of all these different mystical writings. So then I come now to uh, Hildegard of Bingen. Okay, so I'm sort of running these in chronology. So now we move from the Middle East back to the West. In this case, Germany, actually, I think. And this mystic named Hildegard, who is quite remarkable, in a way, sui generis, as they say, of her own kind. Um, in that, uh, here she is. So notice the dates here. She is in the Middle Ages, really during the period where the Crusades are still sort of going on, right? It's that culture, it's that context, and here she is, this uh, spiritual person who's devoted her life to God, right? And she writes. Actually, she's the first one that we know of to write what I call a religious musical, right? She wrote religious musicals, the sort of forerunners of opera, one might say, right? Where there's a story going on, and the story is told in song with lyrics uh, and music. And music is extremely important to her in her life and her expression of it. in a way, she sort of breaks, or not in a way, she does break new ground in Western culture in terms of how people thought about music and story because of the way that she combined them. Is very popular. And she wrote other pieces of music. She also was a student of botany and medicine of the time and that sort of thing. So she's, again, a polymath, right? As they call them, people who know a lot about a lot of different things. And so she's quite remarkable, especially in that era when education um, was pretty much confined to men, right? So how exactly she was able to access all this knowledge is in a way a surprising thing. Obviously, she must have had some cooperation with somebody who was in the established order, but in any case, it's not so much that she was able to study, but how well she assimilated and understood it and wrote about it. So she's very remarkable person as a historical person. But I chose a few passages again from her writings that reflect something of her own um, spirituality, her mysticism. I would describe her in effect as a nature mystic, in the sense that her her focus and her realization of the divine is very much related to the natural world, right? So it's not just the world beyond nature, where a lot of times the mystics sort of say, okay, well, that's sort of the lowest level, and we must be beyond that. But nature mystics and others, there's an element of her mysticism that sort of reflects that idea of everywhere I looked, only God I saw. Right? She wrote that everything that is in the heavens, on earth, and under the earth is penetrated with connectedness, penetrated with relatedness. So there's that mystical idea of the oneness of all things. Now talking about, again, like the beads on the thread, right? The connectedness is a way of talking about the unity of all, where you can acknowledge a variety of different forms and conditions and people in the world around us, and at the same time see them as all connected, see them as in terms of relatedness rather than in terms of otherness, getting beyond the duality. I see Derek. Hello, Derek. Okay. Um, so then she says, I love this passage too. Every creature is a glittering, glistening mirror of divinity. Okay, so this is a little bit different way of talking about it that in effect is kind of safe in the context of the way Christianity always is thought of, and theistic religions think of God as always having to be in some sense other. So rather than speaking as the creatures are an appearance of God or manifestation of God, they are mirrors, right? So they're reflectors. So not quite the same thing as identity with God, or she still has an idea of the immanence of the divine in everything, but she's using language that I think is probably more acceptable. And I don't think she was doing it in any way of compromising her vision. This is sort of the way she saw it. She sees everything, every creature, as a mirror of divinity. But even that is sort of expands the bounds of what the divine was usually thought of in that era, right? Because we might say, well, human beings are made in the image and likeness of God, and so in that sense, they can be thought of as mirrors of divinity. That's not too far fetched. But she doesn't just say humans, or she doesn't say Christian humans, or she says every creature. So there's a universality to it that pushes the boundaries of the usual ideas of the divine. Uh, there is the music of heaven in all things. There's that musical metaphor that I love in there. And she's kind of she'd be right at home in a modern sort of ecological movement as well. I think is obviously in a feminist spirituality. The word, right? The word, again, the word is the Christ. In the beginning was the word. The word is living, being, spirit, all verdant greening, all creativity. This word manifests itself in every creature. So there, now she does use that word, that language of manifestation. But this idea of greening was very important throughout her writings. The greening, the verdant greening, is identifying the divine with, with the earth as also having a divine. So not something that's the earth, not something that we live on that serves our purposes, but in a sense we're connected to it in a very deep and spiritual way. So she emphasizes again creativity, which she expresses in her spirituality, in her ways of talking about the divine. So, any thoughts on that? Any of you maybe have studied Hildegard and could say a little bit more about her, or um, any comments on anything I've said?
Well, this is Maya.
Hi, Maya.
Ayya. I think it's her who fell out with her superiors because she allowed a human to be buried in the cemetery of her cloister, who was not who had not died in Christian faith, and that's her, right?
That sounds right. I when you're saying that, it was like, oh, I didn't hear that story. No, I do think I remember reading that somewhere. Yeah, I think that is.
Out, and then later on she was brought back into the fold, but she was actually excommunicated because she allowed a human who was a sinner in the Catholic understanding to be buried in her yard, and she had a great sense of compassion. But I have a question for you, if I may. Is this a good time to ask a question, or shall I wait till later?
Every time's a good time to ask a question.
We are talking about all these mystics really with such profound commitment, pursuing oneness. Then what would the mystics say did we end up coming to this planet where everything is duality?
That sort of gets into that would depend on how they would express it would depend on their theology, and I'll use the word metaphysics also, right? Because you think about say Plotinus, his approach to that was, very often adopted, modified somewhat by mystics, the ones that did talk about that. And so the idea in Plotinus was that at the top of the hierarchy, if you will, of being, and there's only just the one being that emanates. So remember the metaphor of the sun, where it radiates things outward. Well, this radiation, this emanation, goes through these different dimensions, right? But the further the radiation gets away from the one, so you have to kind of think of it as a sort of, when we say outward movement or outward manifestation, the further it gets away, the less like the one it becomes. So each level is a little bit less than the one, which is the one ultimately indescribable, and then you get into the realm of divine ideas. That's the second emanation, and then you get the world, so and so on. And so in Plotinus, by the time you get to nature, it's as far reaching as creation or emanation goes, and it's the dimension that we live in, that we call the world, where we're not perceiving the unity of everything, and hence duality might be a way of expressing it, right? In China, they've got the yin yang, where there's always a little yin in the yang, and always a little yang in the yin. So they sort of reconcile duality by saying, well, that's how creation works, right? It's got to have it's the interaction of these two elements, but they're not really separate. So that's where the sort of the Taoist mystic would go. It's a really good question, because it's a hard one to answer if you take it that there's one reality, it's all there is. So how can there possibly be even sort of an illusion of duality?
Yeah, I mean, when you think about you're raising a child, you want the child to understand what what is hot and cold, what is up and down, right? And you wanted to develop a relatively flexible sound ego, right? Which differentiates, which analyzes, which calls things by name, right? It's all that. And then you come actually into a formation of duality by the time you're 6 and 7 years old, right?
Well, I can, you can look at all the different mystics and see what they have to say about it. I've sort of drawn my own conclusion, which is it is impossible to be creative without uh, having some forms as a manifestation. And as soon as you have forms, you have boundaries that distinguish one form from another. The illusion that we live in is that the boundaries are separative, right? The boundaries are separative. But if we think about it, even at the physical level, and this would be true of any kind of world you could remake, you would have to have forms, and the forms would have boundaries in some sense that distinguish one form from another. If you think about like your body, you can think of your body as sort of alone and alien in a mysterious world and separated from everything. But the reality of it at the physical level is my body is constantly interactive with everything around me. If I couldn't breathe the atmosphere, I would be dead, right? My skin absorbs the heat. My body absorbs the water, right? My eyes absorb the light. My ears absorb the sound. So I am never separate from anything in my environment. Everything, as she says, is connected, penetrated, relatedness. The illusion comes in when people make the imaginative, and again, it's sort of I consider it sort of a function of imagination. They take it a step too far and they think of I'm separate, I'm other, my group is other, right? My group is other. My group is white group. My group is white, and that group is black. So there must be something wrong with them because they're a different color, right? And so we get into this weird sort of notion that we can somehow live in isolation from the environment and from humanity. And if you just keep pressing that, we can't live in isolation from the earth or the sun and so on. That's all illusion. And that, I think, is the cause of our problems. We get caught up in the illusion of otherness and separation, and we don't perceive the divine unity, and therefore we start behaving in ways that are caused by the illusion of duality. That's sort of my way of talking about that. But you could look at, again, what
I agree.
kindness has emanation and so on. Yeah, it's a great question. People
No,
have been puzzling about it for thousands of years.
thank you. Thank you.
So everybody sort of, I guess, needs to find the answer that makes the most sense to them. That's mine, for what it's worth. Anybody else have any other thoughts about Hildegard? I know there's a lot of attention that's being paid. Oh, I see Brendan. I didn't realize Brendan was here. Hi, Brendan. Any others have thoughts on Hildegard? Thank you, Maya, for that, because I didn't recall that story about her being temporarily excommunicated, but that sounds familiar to me.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. It's another case of a mystic getting in trouble. Yeah. Diane, do you have something?
So what was she a Catholic nun?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
So was this part of Catholic beliefs at that time? Or was she sort of like the Sufis, kind of separate from the traditional beliefs? And where does she fit in with the traditional Catholic at that time?
Well, she thought an experience for herself. And in any era in Catholicism, you're going to find people who are sort of mystics and generally, like I said, sometimes they get in trouble, sometimes they don't. And that has to do with kind of the language that they use. If the language sounds orthodox to the people that are in charge, so the Pope and the bishops, whatever, then they're fine. If their language sounds a little bit off, if there's something that's suggestive of, and sometimes mystics just get in trouble because with the establishment, because they develop a following, right? They develop a following, and the establishment finds that threatening, and just so by the very fact of doing that. So that sometimes happens. So Yeah, I mean, she's Catholic. She's in the context of the church. That's pretty much all there is in Germany in that era, right? And so her, I think probably because of her great creative talent and her work as a healer in the context of that culture, you know, and her language, she manages to avoid expressing her mysticism in ways that shock the sensibilities of her superiors for the most part. So, um, but even at that, you know, she did things that were, as Maya pointed out, were integrity with her uh, her spiritual perspective that were suspect to the establishment. The establishment didn't quite accept that, so she got in a little bit of trouble, but she managed to get back out of it.
Actually, I think a couple of years ago, she was canonized as a saint now.
Oh, was she canonized or beatified or something like
think-
that? Yeah, I don't.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think I had looked that up before, and I didn't see that she was officially a saint. So maybe on her way to sainthood.
Yeah, I think it's recent, but I think she is.
Okay, cool,
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah, some of our mystics are official saints as well. So they obviously found ways to be in their world without offending the sensibilities of their, as I said, their superiors. And again, you can see how that's very contextual, because people in one part of one part of Europe, the leaders might be more conservative and more paranoid than they are in others. So what you get away with to a certain extent depends on the sort of, you know, call it religious politics. Um,
Well, I think she offended until a few years ago.
yeah, well, they weren't quite sure what to make of her, right? I mean, yeah, she wasn't considered an anathema, right? Declared an anathema or anything like that, but they weren't quite ready to make her a saint either. But she's you. By the way, if you're sort of interested in this, you can just go into YouTube, type in music of Hildegard of Bingen, and you'll see performances of it. They're modern people who are doing performances of her music. So if you're interested in that,
She
you know.
is a saint. She has been sainted. She was an abbess of a monastery on the river Rhine. So I just looked it up.
Oh, good, thank you. So she has been declared a saint. She's
Yeah.
officially a saint.
Yeah.
Okay.
Not only is she a saint, she's a doctor of the church. She's only one of 4 women that is a doctor of
Yes.
the Catholic Church.
Yes, I knew that. I just didn't mention it. I kind of forgot about it. Sorry.
Yeah.
I'm not remembering immediately all this details about these different people. So thank you for sharing that. I'd forgotten about the doctor. Was that recent, or was that longer ago and I just forgotten?
I don't know when it happened.
I
Okay.
think that's been for a long time.
Yeah, I was thinking, yeah, when you said that, I thought, oh, wait a minute, that was something. But I also
The
thought I had read
sainthood.
something that she hadn't quite been made a saint yet or something, or
The
officially. But
canonization is recent, but she was for a while considered a doctor.
okay. Yeah, okay, so that's sort of in the context of Catholicism. My primary interest is who they were and what their experiences were and how they talked about them. So I occasionally forget some of those details. Obviously important, but Rosemary?
Yeah. What impacts me, what blows my mind this time as we go through these mystics and every time is no matter where they are or what culture they come from or what language they speak, they come to the same understanding of creation and oneness and, oneness.
It is kind of mind-blowing, right? Because they're also using different language and different terms. So a Christian mystic of the Middle Ages would not have recognized what the word Brahman meant or Atman, right? They might not
Right.
even realize they were saying the same kinds of things. But now that as everything sort of gets translated and we're able to, in our own languages, explore some of these things, we go, oh my gosh, these people are like having the same experience, talking about their And there's a very specific worldview here, isn't there? There's a way of
It
looking at the
certainly
universe
is. Yes.
that's, yeah,
And it
that's
comes
kind of the
up
same.
every place,
Yeah.
the same vision, which is amazing. And of course, it corresponds to whatever mystical experiences we've had as individuals.
It would be even more mind blowing if I did an even more exhaustive course on this. So we're kind of skipping across the surface. And so if you find somebody that you think, oh, I got to find out more about that person, it's definitely worthwhile, in my opinion, look into any of these folks and see what else they have to say. So
Mhm.
I'm going to go
And
ahead and
thank
move.
you for introducing us to the Chinese ones, because I hadn't, I mean, obviously I'm aware of Confucianism and the Tao, but I hadn't really been aware of those particular teachers. Thank you.
Yeah, they're pretty much everywhere. Uh,
Yeah.
like you say, in every context. So, okay, so that completes the second millennium. And I'm going to see how am I doing on time. I want to get a little bit into the third millennium since I have a little more time left. I've divided this up into millenniums. Well, obviously, I don't have an entire millennium yet here. We'll have to wait to 2200 before we have the entire one completed. So we're in the midst of it, right near the end of it. Whoops. Okay, so I want to do that because just of how many of these folks there are, because we seem to be very far away from the 20th century here, and we are, but we'll get closer by the end of next week. This is one again. Hildegard's one that's been very intriguing to people in recent times, and Rumi is another one, although from the Sufi tradition. So now we move back into the sort of the context of Islam. Rumi's poetry is like in this past 20 years or so has been extremely popular, sort of almost like a best-selling poet. I'm not sure exactly when or how it caught on, but you hear more and more people making references. Oh, I know Rumi and that sort of thing. So, Rosemary? Oh, you're muted. Rosemary, you're muted. Okay, there you go.
Yes, if I may say more about, just a little bit more about Rumi. I've been learning as I've worked with many Muslim young people over the past couple of years that in Islam, Rumi is considered the great teacher. And you can quote Rumi without anybody accusing you of not respecting, of not using the right language. But
Right.
all of the teachings of Islam are in Rumi.
Yeah, that's a really good point. AlGhazali is also acceptable. I mentioned AlGhazali previously. Actually, any of the ones I think covered are acceptable within most contexts of Islam, but not all, because we know there's conservative liberal.
Right. Whereas you don't, if you're not Muslim, you don't want to mention the Prophet, and you don't want to mention the Quran, because there are so many rules about what you need to say. And
Yeah.
if you don't do it right, they think you're being sacrilegious.
Ah, yeah.
But you can talk about Rumi.
That's good to know in case I ever do that. Well, yeah, that's true. Well, that's good. That is a good thing to know. Yeah. So so Rumi's kind of like, would be like, I suppose, uh, quoting Thomas Aquinas in the context of Catholicism. Anything that you quote from Aquinas is perfectly okay, right?
Whether
So,
anybody understands it or not.
right, exactly. Yeah, that's the other question. Well, mystics aren't always easy to understand. Um, I pulled out this. We can pull out. Obviously, there's a lot of poetry we could go into for Rumi and any of these, like a full study of. But I like to pick out a few things that I particularly resonated with. So those are sort of individualistic selections, I guess. This one to me is a pretty good description of the path of a mystic, right? In poetic terms. So straightforward thy vision be, gaze not left or right. So one of the things that you find in mystical practices is the emphasis on the idea of concentration. Concentrate on uh, without your attention being distracted. So it's bringing the attention inward from all the sort of outer broad distractions and focusing on very specific, as we might say in unity, divine idea. So right here we see sort of the mystics practices what is often called concentration. Straightforward thy vision being, gaze not left or right. His dust is here, and he in the infinite. So this whole world behind us is sort of like the dust of God, right? Sort of like when you clean your houses, when you do dusting, you're just cleaning what's been left behind. You're not cleaning the living being. You're cleaning the dust that's been left behind. So his dust is here in the world. So there's the idea this God is the infinite is beyond. Okay. So as salt resolved in the ocean, I was swallowed in God's sea. Past faith, past unbelieving, past doubt, past certainty. So here's like a nice compact description of the mystical experience where the self just gets dissolved. There's no longer a sense of self. There's only the divine. And the experience is so profound that we can't even describe it in terms of believing or not believing, in terms of doubt or certainty. It's beyond our conceptualization. It's dissolved, swallowed. And then this next part is another typical mystic description of the idea of the light, right? And of course, it's not a world. Augustine even used it, but it's not a worldly light. We just have to think of it as light as sort of illumination of consciousness rather than illumination of the physical world. So suddenly in my bosom a star shone clear and bright. All the suns of heaven vanished in that star's light. Into my heart's night, along a narrow way I groped, and lo, the light, an infinite land of day. So you probably have heard of the expression dark night of the soul. It's a lot of times referred to in John the Cross. And I've a lot of people talking about dark night of the soul as a space of, high negativity that people talk about as depression or just a really dark time in the usual sense. But sometimes when the mystics, and John of the Cross, I think, is an example too, but here Rumi, the mystics will talk about this entering into this darkness not as a negative thing, but a sort of recognition that there's something they weren't yet seeing. So to go through, they're not yet seeing divine light. So going through the night is just a way of getting into the place where you perceive the light, where you perceive the infinite. So sometimes they'll use that. They'll use night not in a sense and not in a negative sense, but as a passageway that one goes through. And so sometimes they'll talk that way. And of course, they're always being poetic. But remember that in other, we talked about I don't know if you remember the word apophatic mysticism, but where the mystics will talk about God as the dazzling darkness, so that the darkness itself is the thing, is their metaphor, that the darkness beyond the light. So we're just dealing with metaphors because they're trying to use the natural world as a way of talking about their experience and what they've gone through. So this is like one example from Rumi. A lot of Sufi poetry sounds like love poetry. So if you pull different things in different pieces from Sufi poetry, you probably could put together a pretty good Valentine, right? Because the language is very reminiscent of what we think of. Okay, so we're still roughly in the same era. We're moving back to Germany and Meister Eckhart, which seems like a reasonable place for me to close. Most of you have heard references to. I'm sorry, I look behind to see what time it is. Have heard references to Meister Eckhart. Eric Butterworth is very fond of Meister Eckhart, so he quotes him fairly frequently. If you're a Eric Butterworth fan, and who is it? Matthew Fox, I think, quotes a lot of from Eckhart. And Eckhart again is one of those mystics who did get in trouble, but he also had the good sense to make his transition before anything was done about it. So they were, because his language pushed the envelope of what was acceptable, right? Especially when he talked about God as nothing. Okay, so in his era, in his time, in his place, that was not acceptable. If he lived in 5th century Syria or whatever, when Dionysius lived, it wouldn't have been a problem. But where he was in, you see the 1200s, 1300s here in Germany, some of that language they thought was heretical. They weren't accustomed to it. So just a few passages that I like, and obviously Eckhart's another one you can quote extensively from and never run out of insights. But the core of the soul is the central silence. I like this passage because it sounds like Charles Fillmore. Okay, some of the things I've read in Charles Fillmore, the silence, the all power, Charles said, comes from the silence. The central silence, the core of the soul, is the pure peace, an abode of the heavenly birth, the place for this event, this utterance of God's word. Here, God enters the soul with all he has and not in part. I think this might have been from a Christmas sermon, talking about when he talks about the heavenly birth, he's talking about the birth of Christ, which takes place in the soul, and where it takes place is in the central silence. So he's clearly familiar with these deep states of consciousness, and what they would have called prayer, what we might call meditation, where one enters into that space where there's just peace. And then that's where the word, in the beginning was the word, that's word, which is, in Christian terms, identical with the Christ. That's where it enters in, and not in a piece, not a little bit, but the wholeness of God, the allness of God enters into the soul through this core of the soul that's silence. So then God begets his son. The core of the soul is made one with it. Man's whole blessedness lies in that unity. So it's clear in Eckhart's view and the mystical view that this realization of oneness, if we can put it that way, this realization of unity is, in effect, our ultimate purpose as beings, is to find that union that's already there, to become aware of it, to experience it, to live from it. In one of the wonderful books that's a discussion of mysticism is called The Perennial Philosophy by Aldous Huxley. And Huxley asserts in that book that that's the reason for human existence. The reason, and I love that, the reason for human existence is to have this realization of the truth of the divine in all, including in us, to have that realization. So he goes into also quoting from the mystics in their path and so on. So our blessedness, or our reason for being from the mystical perspective, is actually coming into this realization of the divine unity, not just God in us, but in everything, or everything is, Hildegard put it, everything is a glistening mirror of the divine, right? Whereas others put it as everything is an appearance of God. And then this final one, which I'll leave you with. I pulled it out of context, obviously. All right, so I'll just read it, and then my best to explain what he's getting at here. A flea, we all know about fleas. A flea, to the extent that is in God, ranks above the highest angel in his own right. Thus, in God, all things are equal, and are God himself. Well, that's pretty clearly blasphemous in 14th century Catholic Germany. But this idea of the flea, the flea to the extent that it is in God. So what he's saying here is how divine, in effect, how divine something may be depends on how we consider it. If we think of the flea in its fundamental unity with the divine, how it stands in infinite mind, it is equal to anything. It is God himself, right? And so it ranks above a highest angel in his own right. So we think of the angel as sort of distinct or separate from God. And we can also think of the angel, obviously, as being in God. But he's saying, well, how are we looking at it? So we look at the angel like the angel Gabriel, right? You think of angel Gabriel as a being sort of distinct from God. He ranks lower than a flea that we might consider to the extent that it is in God. So I think it's a sort of interesting way of getting at some of what mysticism is just how you look at the world and how you see things in the world. So I think that's a good place to stop because we run out of time, partly, right? And even though I've only gotten to the 14th century, I promise you I'll get to the 20th century next week in our final week. So anybody have any comments or questions? Yeah, Lisa.
I'm curious why you skipped over St. Francis.
Ah, well, I'm focusing on, and again, I have to skip over some people, and I know you love St. Francis. You bring this up every time. Um, uh, so I'm focusing on the ones that are what's the word? That's the contemplative mystics, right? And the so well, I mentioned before the idea of a bhakti, the person's devotional God, where God is sort of always other. Francis is like one of those for the most part. Francis does, I mean, his beautiful prayers and poetry are obviously, mystical, and from that sort of devotional type of mysticism. And I thought about Francis, but I also thought, you know what? Everybody knows Francis. So let's introduce people to some people maybe they don't know. But
Makes
yeah,
sense. Thank you.
I kind of feel like maybe St. Francis deserves his own whole course.
Amen to that.
Yeah. But it's a good point. So he's a mystic. What was who was the one I was talking about? Rabia. Okay. I
Mhm.
talked about seeing where God is always sort of other. That's a perfectly legitimate kind of mysticism. But if you open the door to that, you're opening the door much wider in terms of who could be included, and then it becomes simply unmanageable to determine how many of the hundreds and hundreds of mystics one can choose from, because there's more of that type than there are the ones I'm talking about that have this idea of the ultimate as uh, absolute oneness, the idea of nothingness and infinity. I find this language sort of uh, more interesting, and we're less familiar with it. So to some extent, that's sort of my approach. Lisa, maybe you should do a course on Francis and
Can I say something about the summer, Lisa? Not yet.
No. There is a
yeah,
course coming up through the Center for Action and Contemplation called the Franciscan Way, so I'll be a part of that.
yeah.
But we want you to come and do something for us in unity.
It was Francis and Bonaventure. Yes, yeah. That's the Franciscan tradition. Yeah, it's definitely. I mean, there's obviously a lot of people I have to leave out because I'm trying to encompass the whole world. So I'm finding the ones that I have. Like
I
as soon
understand.
as soon as you get into Bhakti language, then you get into the Bhakti people in Hinduism. It's language about Krishna, and even Bhakti in the Christian tradition, it's all about Jesus, which is great. But then you miss the common ground because the language is still more linked uh, to the specific tradition, I guess is what it is. And there's nothing, I got nothing against that, but it's hard to do a sort of picture of the unity of it all if you focus too much into that direction. So anyway,
I
that's
think
my excuse.
in simple language, St. Francis is duality. And what we're talking about here is non-duality, that God is not out there. I do not pray to a God. It is more of a allness kind of thing. So it's a very subtle shift,
Yeah.
but for me, it's distinguishable from what the mystics that you've already discussed.
It is because again, I only mentioned like really one individual like as a mystic because she's so important to the Sufi tradition. She's Rabia, right? Because God is someone is a being with whom you have a relationship. Whereas in mysticism, God is your being, right? And that's sort of the way they talk it. Or the mysticism I'm talking about. I'm not going to rule out the Bhakti format as a kind of mysticism, but it is distinguishable. Yeah, that's you put very eloquently and elegantly what I was trying to get at. So thank you for that. Any other thoughts or comments?
Wonderful class. Thank you very much. Very
Thank
much.
Right.
you.
Thank you for
Excellent.
being here. It's always so much fun when there's other people here beside me. So
Well, I'm so glad it's on YouTube because I set my watch and I don't know, I was working on taxes. I must have just turned off the alarm and kept working. And all of a sudden I realized, oh, missing class.
I'm uploading it. Let me stop the recording, but I